On a quiet, desolate road in the late afternoon, a modest car cruised down the pavement, its driver calm and composed. Behind the wheel sat a black woman, her demeanor serene as the sunlight glanced off the worn paint of her vehicle. From the shadows of a parked patrol car, a figure emerged, a police officer, his eyes narrowing as he fixated on her. His assumptions were instantaneous, his judgment rooted not in the law but in prejudice. He flicked on his lights and siren, the flashing reds and blues breaking the stillness of the road. The woman pulled to the side of the road, her hand steady on the wheel. The officer exited his cruiser with a swagger, his posture dripping with authority. As he approached the car, his expression was set, a mixture of suspicion and condescension. His first words, sharp and cold, carried the weight of his assumptions. "License and registration," he barked, leaning heavily into her window, his hand resting on the holster of his weapon. The woman complied silently, her movements slow and deliberate. She handed over the documents without a word, her calm demeanor in stark contrast to the tension radiating from the officer. His eyes scanned her license, his brow furrowing as if searching for an excuse. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Her response was measured. "No, officer. Perhaps you can explain." Her composure irritated him, fueling his desire to assert control. "Your taillight is out," he said curtly, though her car was in perfect condition. She glanced at the rearview mirror, her gaze steady, but she said nothing. Imagine thinking you hold all the power, only to realize you've walked straight into a trap. A racist cop pulls over a black woman, confident he can intimidate her. But what he doesn't know is that she's not just any woman. She's the mastermind of a federal operation designed to expose officers like him. What happens next will shock you to your core. A dramatic takedown, a system unraveled, and a reckoning long overdue. This is more than just a story, it's a statement. Stay locked in, because once you see this, you'll never look at justice the same way again. Subscribe now. You don't want to miss what's coming. The officer leaned in closer. "Step out of the car," he demanded, his voice firm. But the woman did not flinch. Instead, she turned her head to meet his gaze, her expression unreadable. "May I ask why?" she inquired, her tone respectful but unwavering. Her question, so simple yet pointed, ignited his frustration. He straightened, his face hardening. "Are you refusing to comply?" "No, officer," she said, her voice calm. "I'm simply asking for clarification." The tension hung thick in the air. The quiet road now a stage for a confrontation neither party would soon forget. Unseen to the officer, a small blinking device on the dashboard recorded every word, every action. The woman remained composed, as though she had been here before, as though she had been waiting for this moment. But the officer, consumed by his assumptions, could not see what was coming next. The officer leaned closer into the window, his gaze narrowing as if searching for weakness. His tone turned sharp, laced with condescension. "Where are you headed? What's your business here?" he demanded, the questions less about protocol and more about dominance. The woman, sitting poised in the driver's seat, responded with measured precision. "I'm on my way home, officer. Is there a problem with my documents?" Her calmness struck a nerve. His eyes darted back to her license, then up to her face, his skepticism growing. "A taillight out, improper lane use. You seem to have a habit of breaking the law," he sneered, though none of these violations had occurred. The woman didn't waver. "I'm sure there's been a mistake, officer. My taillights are functioning, and I've stayed within my lane." Her words were respectful but firm, an unsettling combination for a man used to submission. Her composure was a mirror he could not escape, reflecting his every insecurity and unchecked bias. His voice rose, thick with frustration. "Are you arguing with me? Because I can make this a lot worse for you." Her gaze met his, steady and unflinching. "I'm simply stating the facts," she said, her tone betraying no fear. The officer stepped back, his hand brushing the holster of his weapon, a theatrical gesture meant to intimidate. He puffed out his chest, his voice now loud enough to echo down the empty road. I could impound this car right now. Maybe throw in a night in jail while we sort this out. Still, she did not falter. If I've done something wrong, officer, please let me know, she replied, her voice smooth as glass, unbroken by his threats. The officer's frustration mounted. He wasn't accustomed to this. Her calmness was an armor he couldn't pierce. He leaned in again, trying to find a crack. You don't get to question me. You think you're above the law. The woman's silence stretched, deliberate and powerful. The officer mistook it for defiance, not knowing it was calculation, a careful stacking of moments, each one recorded and preserved for the reckoning that was drawing nearer. The officer's frustration boiled over, his voice slicing through the still air. Hand over your phone, he demanded, pointing at the device resting on her dashboard. The request was baseless, a blatant overreach of authority. The woman tilted her head slightly, her expression calm, almost curious. May I ask, under what grounds, officer? She said, her voice steady, carrying a quiet confidence that was unnerving. His eyes narrowed. You don't get to ask questions. I said, hand it over. But she didn't move. Her hands remained on the steering wheel, her posture unchanging. I'm sorry, officer, she said, her tone polite but firm. But I'm not required to comply with that order unless you provide a lawful reason. Her words were a match to his already simmering rage. He stepped back, pacing like a predator circling its prey. Step out of the car, he shouted, his hand now gripping the handle of her door. The woman remained seated, her calm demeanor unshaken. I'm afraid I can't do that without proper cause, she said simply, her words landing with the weight of unshakable resolve. To the officer, this was open defiance. He yanked at the door handle, but it didn't budge locked. He pounded on the window with the palm of his hand. Open this door, or I'll drag you out myself. Still, she remained motionless. Officer, she said, her voice carrying an almost eerie serenity, I suggest you think carefully about your next move. Her words froze him for a split second. There was something in her tone. Not fear, not defiance, but a quiet warning. He shook it off, his anger clouding his judgment. You think you're smarter than me? Better than me? He spat, pulling at the door with renewed force. As he struggled, something shifted. The woman's calm wasn't just unsettling. It was deliberate. Her eyes followed his movements, steady and calculating, as if she were observing, not reacting. Officer, she said softly, her voice cutting through the noise, are you certain this is the choice you want to make? Her words were cryptic, their meaning just out of his reach. But his ego, inflated and unchecked, pushed him further. He reached for his radio, barking commands for backup, convinced he needed reinforcements to handle this threat. But the woman didn't flinch. Instead, a faint smile played at the corners of her lips. Not mockery, but something closer to certainty, as though she knew the ending to a story he hadn't yet begun to understand. The officer, blind to the storm gathering around him, was about to make a mistake that would shatter the very ground he stood on. The officer stood by the car, his frustration boiling over into rage. He gripped his radio tightly, calling for backup, his voice sharp and trembling with authority. But even as he spoke, the woman remained calm, unbothered, watching him with an expression that seemed almost knowing. Then, from the shadows of the surrounding area, movement began. Cars that had been idly parked along the roadside, seemingly unrelated, suddenly came to life. Their doors opened and men and women stepped out. Not in uniforms, but in plain clothes, their movements deliberate and synchronized. The officer turned, his brow furrowed in confusion. What's going on here? He barked, his hand instinctively moving to the grip of his holstered weapon. One of the figures stepped forward, flashing a badge. Federal agents, the man said plainly, his voice steady but firm. Stand down, officer. The words hit like a thunderclap. The officer's posture stiffened, his confusion quickly giving way to alarm. Federal agents? What the hell is this? He demanded, his bravado faltering. Another figure approached from the opposite direction, carrying a small device in their hand. It emitted a soft hum, and a red light blinked steadily. All footage is secure, the agent announced to the group, ignoring the stunned officer. Footage? The officer stammered, his eyes darting between the agents and the woman still seated in the car. What footage? The woman finally moved, opening her car door and stepping out with an air of calm authority. She straightened her posture, her presence commanding and unshakable. The footage of this encounter, she said evenly, her gaze locking onto the officers. The officer took a step back, his confusion deepening into fear. What's going on here? Who are you? The woman tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. I'm someone you should have treated with respect, she said. But instead, you made assumptions. You overstepped, and now you'll face the consequences. The officer's face paled. This is some kind of setup, he sputtered, his voice rising. She took a slow step forward, the plainclothed agents flanking her in silence. It's not a setup, she said calmly. It's a test, and you failed. Her words hung in the air, heavy and damning. The officer looked around, his bravado now completely shattered. You can't do this, he shouted, desperation creeping into his tone. One of the agents stepped closer, his badge glinting in the fading light. We already did, he said. The officer's radio crackled as backup arrived, squad cars pulling up with sirens wailing. But as other officers stepped out, they too were met by federal agents, who quickly took control of the scene. The woman stood tall, watching it all unfold. You thought you were in control, she said softly, her voice carrying an edge that cut through the chaos. But today, you learned that justice sees everything. The officer's knees wobbled as the weight of the moment sank in. This wasn't just a traffic stop. This wasn't just another misuse of power. This was something far bigger than he could have imagined, and he was at the center of it all. The silence after the chaos was deafening. The officer stood frozen, his hand still hovering near his holstered weapon, as the woman calmly stepped out of her car. Her movements were deliberate, her presence commanding. The agents flanking her stayed silent, their mere presence amplifying her authority. She approached him slowly, her gaze fixed on his, her composure unwavering. For the first time, the officer felt truly vulnerable. Not because of any physical threat, but because of the sheer weight of her calm, measured confidence. Officer, she began, her voice clear and firm, cutting through the tension like a blade. Do you know who I am? He blinked, his mouth opening to respond, but no words came. She continued, her tone unrelenting. I am the chief strategist for the National Task Force on Law Enforcement Accountability. My team and I have spent months investigating systemic misconduct within departments like yours. And today, she paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. You gave us exactly what we needed. The officer's face paled as her words settled in. He shook his head, trying to form a defense. This is entrapment, he stammered, his voice trembling. You set me up. The woman took another step forward, her eyes never leaving his. No, she said firmly, her tone brooking no argument. We didn't set you up. We gave you an opportunity to do your job fairly, without bias, without abuse of power. And you failed. Spectacularly. Her words were surgical, each one cutting deeper into the officer's crumbling sense of control. He tried to muster some authority, pointing a shaky finger at her. You can't just target people like this. He sputtered. Target people? She repeated, her voice colder now. She gestured toward the agents around her. We didn't have to target you. Your behavior speaks for itself. You profiled me the moment you saw me. You fabricated violations. You escalated without cause. And you made threats to intimidate me into submission. She stepped even closer, her presence now towering over him despite her calm demeanor. "Do you want to know the worst part?" she asked, her voice lowering just enough to force him to lean in. "This isn't the first time, is it? It's a pattern. You thought no one was watching, that there would never be consequences. But today we watched. We recorded. And now there will be consequences." The officer stumbled backward, his eyes darting around as if looking for an escape. I was just doing my job," he said weakly, the confidence in his voice completely gone. "No," she replied sharply, her voice rising for the first time. "You were abusing your authority. You were breaking the law you swore to uphold. And now, the law will hold you accountable.